Ji, Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session named Prison Diaries, Waning Freedoms for Writers and Activists. I am Saroop Ijaz. I'm a lawyer. I work for Human Rights Watch as a human rights organization as the Senior Counsel for Asia. And I'm very privileged and glad to be part of this very important conversation. And we have a very eminent panel for this discussion. I'll briefly introduce the panel. We are absolutely thrilled to have with us Ahdaf Soueif, who is a brilliant novelist, many of you would know, is a rights activist. In particular, her novel Maps of Love remains one of the most exquisite, expansive novels in recent times. She's also one of the most authoritative and, in recent years, and perceptive chronicler of the uprising, of the revolution in Egypt, of the revolution of the Tahrir Square, and she's the founder of the Palestinian Festival for Literature, and we're absolutely thrilled to have her. Next, we have Hina Jilani, who needs no introduction. She is Pakistan's foremost human rights lawyer. She is a global icon for human rights, democracy, rule of law. Personally, she is a mentor and inspiration to me, but for many, many others in the human rights movement in Pakistan and around the world. Our third panelist is Daniel. Daniel Hilton is the head of news for the Middle East Eye. He is, again, one of the finest, most courageous voices journalistic voices covering the Arab world. He has been awarded, amongst other awards, the UK Amnesty International Award for his work on war crimes and civil war atrocities in Libya. Ala Abd Fatah is a panelist that we don't have with us today. He is in a prison cell in Egypt, a place where he spent many, many years. His latest incarceration is because of, or sentence, is because of spreading fake news and retweeting a tweet. He has remained in prison for a long time, missing the birth of his child and the death of his father. He's a software engineer, a blogger, a writer, and one of the shining stars of the revolution at Tahrir. He's also Ahdaf's nephew. A collection of his writings, smuggled out of prison, some of them, has recently been published, and it is titled heroically, "You Have Not Been Defeated Yet." And I'll begin by reading just a few words, Fatah's few words, before I open this conversation, and start with Ahdaf. And this is what he wrote at the Al-Duki police station in 2019. This is from one of his essays titled The 5 Metaphors of Healing. And this says, "They will not eject you from history as long as you can still speak. They will not banish you to the past as long as you can still listen. But which present do you inhabit? Haunt the dreams of your comrades and the nightmares of your enemies. Live in a future that never came. Be a specter, a memory, and a herald. Remind them that the current state was not inevitable until it came to be. Do not occupy yourself with the question of why this very possible future failed. Leave the victorious to grope answers. Be the question and do not heed your impotence. A ghost has no need for material presence or actions. You merely need to shimmer." This is just to begin with words which is as exquisite, as in some ways hopeful, I think is fitting when talking about Allah's work. And I'll begin by sort of Ahdaf. Uh, of course, we are talking, there is a personal connection to it. Of course, he's your nephew. But you also, there was a brief shining moment in Tahrir, in Egypt, in the rest of the Arab world, where it seems that democracy, human rights was going to be ascendant, for want of a better word. And now with Fatah's case, Allah's ordeal, and with thousands of others, 60,000 prisoners, according to some estimates, only in Egypt, that moment has quite spectacularly been lost. But when you read Allah's work, it seems that there is a hope and a determination. For example, to quote another thing that he writes arrestingly, he said, I've inherited from my father a prison cell and a dream. And you have spoken about the revolution in Tahrir, about the art, for example, at Tahrir Square, the graffiti, the young people. So what motivates this, for example, the hopelessness of the situation, of Allah's situation? What do you think would keep them, what motivates this generation? Do you think there's a generational shift? Do you think what happened in 2011 has led to a generational shift, looking at taking Allah's example? And also, as a writer, is it inevitable that all writing, all art, all literature under authoritarianism will have to be political? Because so I'll start with that, the loaded questions. Yes.
Okay, these are like 3-4 massive questions, all just sort of to start with. So anyway, can I just begin by saying how very delighted I am to be back in Lahore, and how very, very much I value this festival, which beautifully and elegantly combines art with public cause, with politics, which is really a bit of an answer there, because I think it's very hard if you're living under huge oppression. Then it seems, I don't even know if it's possible to produce work that is not political. I mean, it would certainly seem like an avoidance, but I don't know even if it can be done. So that's just a quick answer. I would also just like to say how honored I am to be sharing a podium with you, truly, really, and of course delighted to be with Daniel. Okay, this was meant to be a book launch for a book which actually isn't being on sale outside. I mean, I hope it will actually hit the bookstores at some point, but it can be ordered, and I'll tell you where to order it from. And the book is by my nephew, so I am, in this session, I am auntie, really. And yes, of course, I have a tremendous interest in my nephew and a great love and admiration for him. But also, as you very rightly said, there are 60,000, we estimate 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt now. And as I said in an earlier session, very many of them are people who are opinion leaders who have a great deal to contribute. I think that one of the things that I'd like to say about this book, and I will come to the things that you've mentioned, is that it's not actually a prison diary. This is a compilation of Alaa's writings since he started engaging in writing with the revolution in 2011. So in fact, the very first piece that is in the book is a piece that was published in a newspaper in July 2011, Who Will Write the Constitution? And this was part of, I mean, this is a very representative of the kind of contribution that he was making from the beginning on the ground, in that he set up an initiative with a lot of other young people to send out thousands of activists into the country to elicit from people responses as to what would you like Egypt to look like. And he was inspired by the South African constitution and by Italian constitution, and was very, so as well as being on the street in Tahrir and actually all over the country, he was setting up initiatives that were what you could call democracy from the ground up. On the question of a generation, I think one of the things that Alaa says in an interview in Gaza, actually, is that at one point, and certainly when you are defeated as we are, you've gone out, you've challenged the system, and you've broken some boundaries, but eventually you've hit a ceiling. You've hit a ceiling and you've been defeated. So you know where that ceiling is now. And what it will take is the next wave of people who are younger, who have not hit the ceiling, and who have the illusion that you used to have, that it's possible to break through completely, that there is no ceiling. And they will take things further and further. So the book is a collection of writings. It's a collection of articles that were written when he was not in prison and published in newspapers. It's articles that were written in prison and smuggled out on tiny little bits of paper, but still published in newspapers when it was possible for opposition papers to do that. And then it is pieces that were smuggled out, but not published in newspapers, only published on social media and in this book. It's also tweets and Facebook posts, because Alaa was very, very much, I mean, he is, in fact, a software engineer working on developing, what they called open source platforms and localizing narrative and so on. And so he was tweeting, writing, Facebook posting all the time. And when the collective that came to prepare this book started going through his tweets from the beginning of the revolution, they found that the word count amounted to about 100 decent-sized books. So that's the level of, and in the tweets, he's often very kind of jokey. The 5-year sentence that he first served from 2014 to 2019 for being present at a protest, he was locked up for 5 years. And he came out, and he has 1 million followers on social media. He came out, and within a couple of hours, his first tweet was, in Arabic and in English, أنا شبح الربيع اللي فات. I am the ghost of springtime past. And that was like, you know, a big, so this is kind of the lightness and the pertinence of how he works. I think I'd better leave the space now for, you know. But I think I will actually say one last thing that you reminded me of. Where does hope come from? As you read through the book, which is a kind of historiography in a way, because you're living through the revolution with its events, with its defeats, with its successes, and the commentary on it, and the attempts to find ways forward. And of course, they, you know, differ from one stage to another until the book ends with statements to the prosecutor, because he is then prevented from writing, prevented from speaking, and the only forum in which he can speak is when he's brought before a prosecutor or a judge. And so he uses that to talk and talk and talk, and the lawyers write down what he says, and we've managed to publish a couple of them here. But he reminds me, this is the last thing I'll say, he reminds me a lot, and I told him this the last time he was out of prison, and he was like, wow, like really humbled. He reminds me of Edward Said in the charisma, in the way he empowers the people that he's talking to, in the way that the young really love him, and in the way that he will always, always try to find a way forward and to find a note of hope and to find something to give people to take away with them that will inspire them and enable them to carry on.
Thank you. I think I'll take take this forward and ask Daniel a question because, you know, in some ways, Allah's, I think there is great symbolism at work, given sort of, you know, a lot, his presence on social media, his activism on social media. I think there is sort of, you know, an allegory, symbolism of this sort of being smuggled out of jail and being published. Because what we are seeing, I mean, it seems that while states are becoming more sort of intolerant of dissent, trying to clamp down on free expression, there is a paradox in this, in the age of social media, digital media, which is while the state's intolerance or states or governments' willingness to clamp down on free expression, on free thought, on dissent, is increasing, simultaneously the capacity to sort of, the impossibility of the task, given the state is no longer the gatekeeper of information in a way that they, which it's hard to imagine, like 20 years ago, where channels could be used to kill switch. So in that, what we're seeing, let's say, in the Arab world, and I talk to Hina about other parts of the world, is that the overt violence of the state now, of the governments now, is because of that frustration? Is it that is leading them? Because the impossibility of censoring all tweets, the impossibility of censoring. Then when I looked at Allah's work, that was the first thing that it occurred to me, that there is great symbolism at work here with sneaking this out and putting it out. The ultimate defiance to, and so as a journalist who looks keenly, particularly a journalist who looks at the Arab world, who looks at areas of conflict, how do you respond to, is the crackdown, the overt crackdown, the violence, the imprisonment, the detentions, are they related to states being nervous or not coming to terms with a new reality of where they're no longer gatekeepers of information?
Yeah, I think that, you know, the Tahrir Square 2011 revolution was inspirational for people across the Middle East and the world. And even though there have been sort of a counter-revolution since, you know, in 2019 we saw protest movements in Lebanon, in Sudan, in Iraq. You know, in Sudan they defeated the long-time ruler, and so there is continuing impact of people seeing what's possible in terms of sort of pushing their boundaries in authoritarian regimes. But also, just like the revolution was inspirational, so was the counter-revolution. And, you know, I think that the way Egypt has, Abdullah Sisi's regime has cracked down on freedom of expression, as Ahdaf said, put 60,000 political prisoners in jail. That, like, regimes across the Arab world are looking at the way Egypt has dealt with its critics, its dissidents, and is copying those methods as well. With social media, it's so difficult to keep under control, and you know, the way that people are able to express themselves without having to go through an editor, without having to find a way to be published, where they can just sort of, and there's something almost disposable about a tweet, where you can sort of have a thought and put it out there and not necessarily think about the consequences. And, you know, in Allah's case, it was just a retweet, that his current case is he's being prosecuted under. And so I think that, you know, regimes are seeking ways to surveil people, to punish people for, you know, minor infractions in tweets. I think the example of Essam al-Zamil in Saudi Arabia is an interesting one. He's an economist who, when Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman floated the idea of putting part of the Saudi Aramco, the state oil company, on the stock market, He took to Twitter to discuss some of his misgivings about that, where he sort of felt that economically it didn't make sense, that the oil belonged to the Saudi people, and he's been in prison ever since. A lot of that time was uncharged. So, you know, there are people have to be very careful in the region, I think, about the way that they use social media, and regimes can't control it all because the volume is just so huge, and there is a certain anonymity you can have as well. But they're trying incredibly hard to clamp down on it.
Thank you. I think, I mean, this, when I was looking at it, I mean, it reminded me of a dark joke that I think under Ziaul Haq's regime is Pakistan, I think sometimes attributed to the Soviets as well, that a prisoner goes to the prison library and asks for a particular book and is told by the jail warden, I'm afraid we don't have the book, but we do have the author. So, I mean, it is, I mean, this is, but moving to Hina, I think if we look at what's happening in Egypt or across the Arab world and look at Allah's case of tweets, people being put into prison, I mean, it's happening in Pakistan, of course. That is, Pakistan seeks to now criminalize peaceful speech in new and more repressive ways. But there is something else which across the region, across the world really now. There was a time when I was asking Ahdaf about the 2011 moment of the revolution. There was a time not too far away where you could look at every country in South Asia and say that it's a democracy. Flawed one, not a perfect one, but it's democracy. And that is now gone. And it seems this impulse to censor has been, I mean, to talk about Pakistan, has been there since the colonial time. What's, in your opinion, is now driving states to get, because we're clearly seeing a pattern of greater intolerance, greater for dissent, greater clampdown, greater repression. What's driving this now? Because we've clearly seen a higher, or is that so? Do you think that states, I mean, be in South Asia, be in Pakistan, be in Orban in Hungary, Duterte in Philippines, Modi in India, and one can say Bolsonaro in Brazil can go on. Is there a global moment of intolerance for free expression as an idea?
Thank you. Thank you, Saroop. And let me first of all, of course, thank the organizers of the Lahore Literary Festival for bringing us all out of our COVID-driven cocoons and being able to see each other in person. I really appreciate the fact that today we are celebrating the launch of a book by somebody who's had first-hand experience of what defense of human rights can lead you into and what the consequences of that can be. There are many people in this hall that I recognize and know that they have been partners with me and others in this long journey of defending human rights. Now, I look at the title of this book. It says, "You have not yet been defeated." For me, there is no yet. I think when we do informed advocacy and defense of human rights, we know very well that success is only a bonus. We believe in our struggle, and in struggle only there is hope. If you stop struggling, then there is no hope. And frankly, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, I am a prisoner of hope. I've been in many prisons during my life, but this is one prison I don't want to leave, because I do believe that while we do achieve a lot, even if we hadn't achieved much, the struggle in itself is a sign that the population, the civil society is alive. And this is what I think most authoritarian regimes fear. And this is the only way for us to show them that any amount of repression or authoritarian control over freedoms like the freedom of expression, assembly, association, will not silence those who seriously believe in transformation and in change. You know, people sometimes think that this whole activity of defending human rights is just a frivolous thing and we do it as a hobby. I assure you, it is not a pleasant experience. I know Nigat Snooki, our friend, is sitting here. She was a partner with us and many others who started our struggle on women's rights during the 80s decade. I have been in the streets and in courts on these causes of human rights. Our hope was not only to raise public awareness and visibility of very serious concerns with regard to the ability of the population in this country to realize their fundamental rights. We were also in the struggle to sensitize the judiciary to their role for the enforcement of people's rights, independent of pressures that they may feel and do get from time to time. I assure you it was not a very easy journey. It was a very painful journey for both the victims that we were trying to protect and for us as well. Nevertheless, I know that a continuous period of repression does send a very chilling message. And it is not possible for everyone at all times to overcome fear, the consequences of courage. And there are times when we see that around us, the crowd that used to give us the security in defending human rights and the courage to go on, that crowd is thinning. And it happens. Let us not deny that and be dismissive of it. Yet, even one person's courage to break the silence sometimes is the, the harbinger of better things to come. I remember in July 1983, the 5th of July, the whole country was silent. There was so much repression. And my father, who had just an hour before been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, took a placard and went to Rawalpindi and paraded in front of the GHQ saying, "We are all guilty." And that broke the silence in many ways. Some newspapers who were afraid even to name freedoms, or at that time to take the name of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto that they had hanged a few years ago, they wrote about this parade. And I was quite surprised when I looked at some of the files very recently and I saw newspapers reporting that event. So, I believe as a human rights defender, these are some of the things that we have to assert and make sure that we are asserting it with some kind of consistency. In my country, and in many places that you have spoken about, Ahdaf and Daniel, there have been periods of great mobilization and then periods of great frustration. Yet, people's aspirations for human rights do not diminish. You asked me the question, Saroop, what happens when in South Asia, for instance, we are all democracies, and yet we have so much tolerance for authoritarianism, for repression of freedom of expression. I believe that democracy has always been challenged. There will never be a time that democracy is not challenged, whether it is in a growing democracy, in a developing country, or in countries where democracies are better rooted. There are always challenges. The question for us right now is, are we going to sit back with our arms folded and become silent spectators of the events that are happening before our eyes? And here I'm addressing the civil society in this country. Things are happening at a certain level. The government is doing something, the opposition is doing another thing. Everything that they are doing is affecting our lives, and we are just watching, as if there is a cricket game going on. We are stakeholders, and I say this with emphasis. Never forget that the only countervailing force, apart from the political parties in any country, is the organized civil society that countervails the force and the power of control of the state. The first thing that states do is to decimate the civil society and never narrows down the space for civil society, and that's what we are going through right now in Pakistan. And I'm sure that both of you have seen this experience. I have seen this in Tunisia. You know, you speak about the Arab Spring. I've seen what's happened in Tunisia. I've seen what's happening in your country and in many other countries. Yet, we are not defeated. I don't think it's a question of yet. We'll never be defeated. And the states have to understand that. We also have to make sure that the challenges to democracy always remain challenges and do not in any way push democracy back to an extent where we cannot claim the values of democracy to be the ones that are normal. What happens outside of democracy is abnormal. We can never accept it as the norm. Pakistan has its challenges, a lot of challenges. It's not just authoritarianism at the government and state level that is our challenge to democracy. We have within the non-state actors also challenging democracy and freedom of expression with that, and our ability to challenge narratives which are taking us away from the values of human rights, the values of rule of law, of peace and tolerance. These are religious extremist groups. And we know that this is something that has tarnished our ability and really potentially left us helpless in order to grow both economically and the kind of social retrogression that we have faced because of this. We have to fight it. Today, even somebody like me feels at a loss on how to deal with what they call sensitive issues. These are not sensitive issues, these are merely issues which we have to fight. Why is blasphemy a sensitive issue? When it is affecting the lives and the ability of people to profess their religion in this country. When it is affecting divergent views from coming forward to, in fact, make religious discourse much more energetic, much more, let us say, fruitful than anything that we are getting right now. So these are some of the issues that we are confronting today, and we have to keep confronting them in different ways. I know that Saroop, in this country, many of the people over here have been our partners, both in thinking about the issues that we confront, how do we deal with civil-military relationship in this country, which affects us. It's not just affecting the political parties. It's not just affecting politicians who are in the leadership today. The erosion of parliament affects us, our right to proper representation, our right to be heard where we should be heard. We should not just be left to be heard in Al-Hamra. We need to be heard in the right forums. We need to be heard by the courts. And I will say this as a senior lawyer, I have no hesitation in saying that the judiciary is not a victim of lack of independence, the judiciary becomes a partner in the lack of independence when it shows its hesitation in dealing with the issue of people's rights. act within the Constitution. You have a role in defending rights or enforcing rights or making sure that people are protected by the Constitution. But don't go beyond your mandate, but at the same time, never hesitate. When you see people who have been disappeared, becoming helpless, their families becoming helpless, because for several years, people have not found the kind of response that we should have had from the judiciary. Disappearances is a serious criminal offense. It's an international crime. And yet Pakistan indulges in it with impunity because the courts have failed to hold the people to accountable for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, of course. Challenges are common as in South Asia or the Arab world, as you said, maybe around the world. But I want to come back to Ahdaf and maybe what about the human rights thing, because when we look at Allah's work, of course, there is his eloquence, his courage is of course striking and completely arresting. But I do want you to also talk about, if possible, about the circumstances in which this writing was done, about, if you know about the prison conditions, for example, because, you know, you said in beginning you were here as an auntie, but of course you are also, you know, that is, it's not optional. You can't opt out of being a world-class novelist. But so for this kind of sort of the process of writing, what would you think of being in the conditions? Would you firstly have insight into the prison conditions, I mean, in which his personal conditions, and then the process of writing under those conditions, and then both as being Allah's aunt, but also as a writer, what would motivate, how would the creative process be in a situation like that?
Okay, well, I really can't pretend to, I mean, I can't speak for how he manages in prison conditions to produce work. I mean, I can tell you how it happens, but how he makes it happen from within himself is really is beyond me. We were really quite okay. So, Ahdaf from prison does not write about prison. He writes about the world. And so, for example, June 2016, he's in Tora prison. He's been in prison for over 2 years. He's halfway through that first 5-year sentence. And he produces a series of articles about how sort of capital finance works, about Uber and the gig economy. Articles that are really to the point, that actually when we look at them now, they are predictive of things that will happen. And he's managing to do this on scraps of paper, and with the only input coming in is state newspapers and state media. But from those and from what he's been thinking about, he manages to put together articles which are now classics about these subjects. At another level, writing in a literary or poetic way, if you like, and actually taking on the issue of the revolution and what it was about and what happened and the defeat and so on. There is a long piece in the book called Graffiti for Two. And there's another prisoner, Ahmed Douma, who they were friends, and they are both, you know, in the same boat of being imprisoned then. And Douma is a poet, and the two men used to shout their lines as they were composing them across the cells to each other. They were never sharing a cell, but they were in the same ward. And at night, after the prison had gone to sleep, as it were, they would compose their work, long considered sections of prose, and then Douma sort of quatrains of poetry. And they explain, in a brief introduction, they explain how they did that, and they apologized to the other inmates of the ward for the disturbance that they caused them every night, and they also say that neither of them ever had the ability to look at the whole text, to hold the text in their hand as a full text. It was always fragments. So there were really a diverse way. In his latest imprisonment, actually, they are so on top of him. They are so strict, and he's not allowed now books or newspapers or media of any kind, or even exercise and so on. And so there are just 2 pieces in the book that were managed to be smuggled out. One, because he was very moved in the latest Palestinian kind of uprising, when for the first time all the cities across Palestine plus Palestinians in the diaspora were all part of one movement, and he wrote a tribute to that. But otherwise, it's not possible. And in fact, I don't know. Well, in fact, under those conditions, when he appeared in front of a judge, and this was last December, again, he gave a half-an-hour argument, literary argument, practically, really, with imagery and consecutive thoughts and beautiful Arabic. And it had all been composed in his head, and he delivered it in court to the discomfort of the judge, of course. And at one point, I was reaching up to see if maybe he did have a piece of paper in his hand, and he didn't. So something is enabling him to do this, and that something is very much part of what he and we are so worried about now, because of the conditions of this imprisonment, because of the no books and no media angle. Yeah, but I mean, he has a very big thing with the judiciary. Alaa's father, Ahmed Saif al-Islam, an article that you wrote, an obituary you wrote very recently about someone here, reminded me very much of Ahmed Saif. He was a big human rights lawyer, and Alaa is very valuing of his heritage. And so one way that you could view the last 10, 11 years now of Alaa's life is actually in parallel and affected by I'm very careful how to use my words, but about what has happened to our judiciary system. In fact, what has happened has led, for example, the Bar Council of Britain, the Human Rights Department of the Bar Council of Britain, to write a public denunciation of the Egyptian judicial system and say that it clearly held the law in contempt. But we've seen the gradual degeneration of the system, to the point where in this last trial, where he got 5 years for tweeting, there were 3 court sessions, and the accusation was that he had retweeted a tweet by somebody who recorded the death of a prisoner. And the court refused to give Alaa or his lawyers the case. They refused to give them the papers which described the case and said what the evidence was, and so on. And the papers were 2,000 words, 2,000 pages about purportedly a retweet. And they refused to give them access to it. So they also refused to allow Alaa to meet his lawyers. However, they transported him from prison. They opened the courthouse. We all went and managed to get ourselves in, and the judge came out and sat there. And it was an opportunity for Alaa and his co-defendants and the lawyers to speak and to make statements. But nothing happened because they wouldn't give them the case papers. And on the 3rd, we knew that they were going to sentence him, and we kind of knew that they were going to give him 5 years. He knew, he guessed. But actually on the last day, the day of the sentencing, we sat in the court. They brought him, but they didn't bring him up to the court. They kept him in the cells downstairs. And we all sat in the court, and nothing happened for like 6 hours, maybe. And then the usher, the clerk, the guy who bangs and says, "Silence, court," he came out of the judge's chambers, stood on the podium, and said, the court has ruled Ali Abdel Fattah is sentenced to 5 years and the other two are sentenced to 4 years each, and ran back inside and slammed the door. The insistence on procedure and the complete, making a mockery of procedure at the same time is really quite puzzling. And I just would like to read you something small here to finish with, which is probably the first time that Ali makes a statement about the judiciary, because he has been constantly, in this last case, making statements about why he needs the case papers. And he says people are saying that this is a show trial, that this is a play, it's theater. Well, I am an inheritor of a tradition of belief in the law. And if this is theater, there is an element of theater in every courtroom. I insist on playing my part as defendant properly. And in order to play my part as defendant properly and to respect the law, I need to see the case. So in here, this is early. This is the end of January 2013, where this is now Morsi's time, the Muslim Brotherhood's time. And they're looking for reasons to prosecute him. He's been prosecuted under every regime that has been, Mubarak, since he's come of age, and Morsi. And so they call him in, and he doesn't know why he's been called in. And so he's tweeting, and these are several tweets here. 2:12 p.m., I am at the main courthouse after being summoned for questioning by Councillor X in an unspecified case. 2:16 p.m., Councillor X was the investigating judge for 2 court cases that he was put in before. 4:04, the charge is insulting the judiciary. I refused to cooperate with the investigation because of the skewed priorities of investigating authorities that ignore complaints about torture but investigate what is published on the internet. 4:14, in my reasons for refusing to cooperate with the investigation, I made special mention of their disregard for the complaint filed by the young people who were accused of assaulting Judge Al-Zind regarding their torture by members of the judicial authorities inside the judges' club. 4:23, I also submitted an official complaint against Field Marshal Tantawi, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, President Morsi, the former Attorney General, and the current Attorney General, accusing them of insulting the judiciary by interfering in its work and perverting the course of justice. 4:24, I have been released. So let's get back to what's relevant. The police are thugs and down with the Muslim Brotherhood. 4:58, the insulting the judiciary case is based on complaints from 1,064 judges against tens of media figures and activists. When will the same number of judges take a stand against human rights abuses? And the last one at 6:34, I call on all defendants in the insulting the judiciary case and other cases which are really to do with settling scores and silencing voices. I call on them to take a similar position and refuse to cooperate with the investigation until the justice apparatus fixes its priorities. So that was in action, as it were.
Thank you. That, along with the rest of Ala's writing, is, as I said, so incredibly powerful and arresting. One would have wanted for this conversation to carry on, both about Ala's writing and the obvious parallels of sort of, in history of writings from prison and about prison, starting with the obvious Gramsci to our context, to young Bhagat Singh's writing, to Faiz Ahmad Faiez's poetry from prison, to Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's writing from prison. But alas, we don't have enough time. But we do have only about 5 minutes for any questions, 5 to 10 minutes for if there are any questions. And I, yeah, okay.
My question is for Hina Jilani. I believe that young people have the power to change the world. And I have a question on behalf of all the young people here, that we sometimes do engage in dialogues with young people in conflict areas, be it Israel or Palestine, or India, or maybe India and Pakistan. And what we find is that our point of views aren't indifferent to what you said about being a prisoner of hope. And so that what can we as young people break this silence and bring about a change and ensure that the human rights activists accentuate our voice and really bring that change onto a global level?
Thank you. I generally refrain from giving advice to the younger generation because everybody has to chart out their own course. And we may not necessarily be the right examples because we act in a certain era and different, maybe in a different context. But to answer your question, I think the very fact that you see an issue and you see a problem and you see a possible solution. Nobody is, all wisdom. But if you see a possible solution, I think it is worthwhile to talk about it. As I said, it's always possible for you to create platforms where human rights can be taken up and you can join other networks and others who can amplify the voices of different sectors of people. So I think in Pakistan and in other countries, these kind of sporadic mobilizations have given us the benefit of creating certain kinds of platforms. Now, look, what Allah has done is not only suffer the consequences of his defense for human rights, he's documented it. And this is the best message, not for the young people only, but for everyone who's trying to defend human rights.
Question as well. Seeing the reaction to Aurat March or the continuous religious extremism in Pakistan, where do you see Pakistan going in matter of free speech 10 years in the future?
The Aurat March, actually, I see as a successor of the 1983 12th of February procession that women started as a protest against what was happening in the country at that time to women's rights, to human rights in particular. And I thought we had overcome those barriers over the years. We had a few good years when women's rights were becoming much more prominent and the challenges to women's right to their choice, etc. Now I see that, I'm surprised. Every year, at least the Lahore Women's March organizers have to come to me to add my name to the applications for NOCs or information to the authorities about this Women's March. This year, some policemen had the temerity to call me and try to censor our slogans, saying what you can and what you can't say during the Aurat March. And this is, I think, a reflection of the fears that we as the civil society have in terms of sustaining and preserving the rights that we have actually, or the battles that we had actually we thought we had won. So everybody, I plead with everyone here, have confidence in your ability to know what is right for you. Have a confidence in your ability to promote your rights. Don't listen to anyone who in any way undermines your ability to do that and undermines your autonomy to determine how you phrase your protest. of course, we are all Pakistanis, we know how to do this. I mean, I've always felt that, you know, anything that the younger generation says, which may sound different to me, is not because it is inappropriate, it's only because every generation has a way of saying things in their own way. So, 3 cheers for the Aurat March. Let's all prepare for the next one, next year, and raise our hand to still forces that wish to harm us or to curtail our ability to express our rights and our freedoms.
Thank you. I mean, I'm afraid I know there are other questions, and many of you would want the conversation to continue, and the conversation can continue after. Once the session is over, maybe you can talk to the panelists personally, because we have a time constraint. My apologies for that. On Ala's book, we will share a link on the recording, and we can share it on right now as well, from where you can buy one, which of course I for one would sort of highly recommend. I think it while written in a very particular context, I think it speaks to the Pakistani context and essentially globally. So I think if Ahdaf wants to guide them, that's how to get the book.
Simpler if I share this with you now rather than individually, sort of very many times over afterwards. If you can order from, the best place to order from is www.freedom4.network, and then it'll give you different options and you'll choose Ala Abdel Fattah. So www.freedomfor.network/ and then choose Ala. And and that way you're not also feeding into the whole Amazon thing.
Thank you. I would end by thanking the panelists, Daniel, Ahdaf, and Hina, and I thank every one of you for taking out the time. Have a good day.
Thank you, Saroop. Thank you.